The Life and Times of Robert J. Wycliffe. Chapter 8. Hostile Influences and Agencies. State of parties unfriendly to the Reformer. Fierce and persevering persecution. Treatment of the Lollards. Condemnation of certain positions of the Reformer. Touching the doctrine and the practice of the Church. His opinions on transubstantiation. Confession, purgatory, and the masses for the dead, and other dogmas of the papacy. It is a question how far the insurrection of 1381 is to be attributed to the doctrines of Wycliffe and his followers. It is true that more effectually to imbue the public mind with his opinions, the Reformer kept a number of his disciples itinerating through the country under the name and character of poor priests. It is true that these men were most assiduous and unwearied in their labor. It is true that thousands listened eagerly to their teaching and as eagerly adopt their opinions. But to say that the civil commotion with which the name of Wat Taylor is so intimately and inseparably associated, and which the Commons of the English played so strange a part, is to be traced immediately to the teachings of the Reformer and his disciples, is a mistake. It was to replenish an exhausted exchequer that the Parliament imposed a new and unusual tax of 3 groats on every person, male or female, about 15 years of age. This imposed, most known by the name of the poll tax, led to more than one crisis in the future history of the people. It was levied with great rigor. Taylor, who was a blacksmith and resided in Essex, was the first to rouse the populace to a sense of its injustice and led them to take arms in resisting it. He had a daughter for whom, on the ground of her age, he claimed exemption. This the tax gatherer disputed, and to ascertain the fact was guilty of some most unmanly and unpardonable indignities. The father was enraged, and aiming a blow with his hammer at the collector, leveled him with the ground. The bystanders, appalled by the spirit of the blacksmith, and resolved to defend his conduct. Having proved himself, as they thought, a champion in the cause of freedom, he was appointed the leader of the thousands who had avowed their willingness to follow him. The men of Kent were all in readiness. Those of Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, and other of the eastern counties assembled at Blackheath, to the number of 60,000, proceeded to the metropolis, attacked and took possession of London, and committed fearful havoc on life and property. At Smithfield, an interview took place between the king and Taylor, in which the latter entered into a detail of the grievances of which he and his followers complained. They required the abolition of poundage, the liberty of buying and selling in fairs and markets, the general pardon and the reduction of the rent of land to an equal rate. If we expect this last item, there was nothing either unjust or extravagant in their claim. Having ordered his companions to retire till he should give them a signal, Tyler now lifted his sword in a most menacing manner, when Treasurer Walworth, apprehending some evil intent on his royal master's life, plunged a dagger in Tyler's throat, and one of the king's knights soon dispatched him. On the loss of their leader, the mutineers prepared to take revenge. Perceiving their design, Richard, who was not more than 16 years of age, rushed into their midst, and with an infallible and intrepid countenance asked them if they would kill their king. Then he offered himself as their leader, and promised to redress their grievances. His words acted like a charm. They immediately lowered their arms, and followed the youthful prince into the fields, where he conferred on them a charter of liberty. It was not in England alone that such scenes were witnessed. All Europe was convulsed. In the disturbed and distracted state of public feeling, the tumult might have occurred without any such stimulus as that supplied by the labors of the rector of Lutherworth. In France and Germany and Italy, such outbreaks were not unusual, and these were equally menacing to the civil and ecclesiastical authorities of the age. There was nothing in her internal condition to exempt England from danger. On the contrary, in their address to the king, the Parliament affirmed that unless the administration of the kingdom were speedily reformed, it must become wholly lost, and that the injuries done to the poor commoner had caused them to rise and commit the mischief done in the last riot, while there was cause to fear still greater evils if a sufficient and timely remedy were not provided. They in fact charged the late insurrection upon the government. In these representations and statements, even the Lords concurred, and therefore nothing could more happily free our reformer from the odium which has been sought to be cast upon him and from his doctrines in connection with this affray. He was no enemy to civil order. He was the last man of his age to encourage the spirit of rebellion. He threw out no flag of opposition to establish authority. Rather did he labor to exalt the civil power and to inculcate the subordination of every member. Such teaching, however, was obnoxious to the hierarchy, and taking advantage of the late riots, they represented to the young monarch that those convulsions which had so recently endangered the interest and stability of the kingdom might be expected to return unless some effective measures were adopted to put down Wycliffe and his followers. Nor let it be forgotten that Courtenay had been elevated to the primacy of man who was not only regarded as the pillar of the church, but by birth and marriage stood connected with the first and most noble families of England. Soon after his elevation, he conveyed a synod to decide on the best course to be taken to repress those opinions which were being so widely diffused as well among the nobility as among the people. They met at Greyfriars on the 17th day of May, 1382, and were proceeding to pass a formal condemnation of the tenets of our reformer, when suddenly the metropolis was shaken by an earthquake, which so disturbed and alarmed the assembly that they would immediately have broken it up as displeasing to heaven, but for the ready genius of the primate who presided, and it conferred a different meaning on the incident, comparing the dispersion of noxious vapors produced by such convulsions with a purity which should be secured to the church as the result of the present struggle to remove the pestilence from her communion. Some of the Reformers' doctrines have been declared erroneous and others heretical. A fierce and fierce persecution was commenced against him and his disciples. They were represented as teaching that the Bishop of Rome had no legislative authority in the Christian church, that the pomp and dignity of higher orders of the priesthood should be done away, that the clergy should have no power either to farm or to live away from their benefices, that confession is superfluous, that the power of granting indulgences or of the binding and loosening is a delusion, that the worship of images is idolatry, that the miracles attributed to them are a deception. Irritated and provoked, the clergy preferred their complaints and the petition to the monarch and the court. By surreptitious and unworthy means, they obtained the sanction of the king and of certain peers to a status which provided for the punishment of heresy. Its real object was to compass the arrest and imprisonment of Wycliffe's poor priests. The sword of the magistrate was henceforth to leap upon its scallop at the binding of the priests, and no proceed instituted against any offenders was to terminate except as the party accused such justice himself according to the law and the reason of the Holy Church. The synod which had condemned the doctrines of Wycliffe met again in June, and a letter was addressed by the primate to the Chancellor of Oxford requiring him within a certain period to publish the proscribed articles in the schools and churches, and imitating the Archbishop's determination to suspend all persons suspected of holding a reformer's views from any scholastical exercises until such time they should have purified themselves from the offenses. The Chancellor himself was rather inclined to his opinions. Several meetings of the Synod were convened. Persecution were taken out and prosecution and carried on against several men of note who were known to be friendly to the new doctrines. Wycliffe, who was then at Lutherworth, waited the issue of these prosecutions with intense anxiety and on several occasions referred to them in his pulpit administrations. Against Courtenay, who had assumed to himself the name and office of Chief Inquisitor, his very soul burned with the fire of a righteous displeasure. He pursueth, he said, a certain priest, because he writeth to men this English, and summons him and trouble him, so that it is hard for him to bear it. And thus he pursueth another priest by the help of the Pharisees, because he preaches Christ's gospel freely without fables. Men who are on Christ's behalf Help ye now against Antichrist, for the perilous times are come, which Christ and Paul foretold. Among the opinions condemned as heretical were those of the Reformer on the nature of the Eucharist. He believed in opposition to the Church that the Lord's Supper, the bread and wine, undergo no change, but remain the same after consecration as before. Nor was he alone in this opinion. It was not till the 9th or 10th century that the dogma of transubstantiation became known, and no sooner was it pronounced than it was opposed. A French divine prelate of the name of Berenger, who lived and died in the 11th century, subjected the doctrine to the most rigorous investigation and had the manly fortitude to disavow it. It had formed no part of the creed of the simple-minded and pious Vaudois. It was unknown in England in the 10th century. Lanfranc, an Italian by birth and who, on the disposition of Stigand, became Archbishop of Canterbury, was the first who wrote against Berengaris and maintained the doctrine of the real presence. It was then taken up by the great body of the Anglo-Norman clergy and met with little, if any, opposition till the time of Wycliffe. This leading error of the Romish Church is thus defined by the sacramental words duly pronounced by the priest. The bread and wine upon the altar are transubstantiated or substitutionally converted into the true body and blood of Christ, so that after consecration there is not in that venerable sacrament the material bread and wine which before existed, considered in their own substance or natures, but only the species of the same, under which are contained the true body of Christ and his blood, not figuratively nor tropically, but essentially, substantially, and corporately, so that Christ is verily there in his own proper bodily presence. It was again this false dogma that our Reformer lifted his voice in loud and solemn protestation. Thus he first did in the course of divine lectures, which he read at Oxford, and in the face of greater excommunication, suspension from all scholastical exercises, and the fortitude of personal liberty, for an assembly of 12 doctors, summoned by the Chancellor, had already condemned his conclusions and decreed imprisonment and excommunication as the punishment of all who should embrace and maintain them. As he had often declared it to be the duty of the magistrate to protect the life, the property, and the personal freedom of the subject apart from all ecclesiastical relations and duties, so now he appealed on his own behalf to the civil powers. Parliament was not then sitting, nor would it meet for some time to come. On its assembly in November 1382, he presented in the form of a petition a summary of his views and opinions. In this doctrine he was not only repudiated the idea of the real presence of the sacrament, but prayed that the doctrine of the Eucharist might be openly taught in all the churches as Christ and his apostles had left it. He asserted that tithes and other voluntary offerings should be withdrawn from prelates and priests who were guilty of great and notorious sins, that it was in many cases lawful and notorious and temporal authority to take away the temporal property of the church, and the religious vows were a mere human device and of no obligation. The effect upon the Parliament of this teaching was that the obnoxious statute of the synod was annulled, and it was declared that men were no further bound to the prelates than were their ancestors in former times. Wycliffe was then summoned to appear before a convocation at Oxford. Though deserted by Lancaster, he was nothing daunted. True to his purpose, he threw himself with renewed confidence on God. He conducted his own defense with consummate skill and dexterity. The confessions which he then made were rather a reassertion than a renunciation of his peculiar doctrines. At such a crisis and in such circumstances, he was not the man to shrink from the open avowal of his opinions. Sentence was passed upon him. Silenced at Oxford and his connection with the university dissolved, he returned to Lutherworth, where, with enfeebled strength and growing infirmities, he devoted his time to such writings as might tend more widely to diffuse his principles and bring about that grand consummation to which his life and liberties had been devoted. Transubstantiation was not the only dogma which he disputed and denied. To Auriculae, confession and the sales of indulgences, the invocation of saints, the worship of images, prayers for the dead, the celibacy of the clergy, he was decidedly opposed. Lingard avows that Wycliffe inculcated the doctrine of purgatory and strenuously maintained the efficiency of the Mass, on which Dr. Vaughan remarks, surely the man who could go through his pulpit services for 12 months together without more than a single reference to the Mass except to censor its imperfection and abuses can hardly be said to have been a strenuous advocate for its efficiency. Mr. Lewis might be right in stating that Wycliffe believed in the bitter pains of purgatory, for during a large portion of his life he did so. But in inquiries of this nature, nearly everything must depend upon dates. To a correct acquaintancy with this subject, it was strictly necessary to know the frequency or the variety of the Reformers' allusions to it, to know also something of the distinction of obscurity that may have marked those allusions, and to know, after all, that before his death, Wycliffe had learned to use the word purgatory as referring merely to an intermediate state through which the most holy of mankind must pass to the final rest. Such an apology is altogether unsatisfactory. It is undeniable that to several of the Romish tenets he adhered till the hour of his death. Up to the last, his mind was not but partially enlightened and as partially informed. The marvel is not that he was on a few points in error, but that he was on so many points in the right, and that amidst so many adverse agencies and influences, he reached so advanced a standpoint. After separation from Oxford, he was summoned to appear before the Pope to answer the charges which he had been preferred against him. Paralyzed and enfeebled in body, he was not in condition to undertake a journey to Rome, and therefore he addressed a letter to his superior in which he professes his joy in the opportunity now given him of telling the Pope the belief which he held. For if his faith was right and given of God, His Holiness would gladly preserve it, and that if his faith was in error, His Holiness would wisely amend it. He then imitates that he took it as a part of faith that no man should follow the Pope, no, nor any saint that is now in heaven, but insomuch as he follows Christ. That he took it as wholesome counsel that the Pope should leave his worldly lordship to worldly lords, as Christ enjoins, and that he should speedily move all his clerks to do so. For thus did Christ, and so taught his disciples. Instead of going to Rome, he remained at Lutherworth, and produced those compositions which were to prove like seed corn cast on the waters, which would find a congenial soil, in which they would vegetate and spring up, and yield 100-fold. Footnote. It is not possible on a limited space even to enumerate the production of the Reformers' pen. The enumeration would extend to several pages and may be found in Lewis, in Vaughan, and Labase. Wycliffe's ritual performances go to make up an amount of composition which seems almost incredible in the circumstances in which he was placed. End of footnote. Many of the theological opinions of our Reformer the reader must have gathered from the preceding pages. Believing in the election of grace, he could not fail to assert that the exclusive dependency of the sinners for the remission of sins must be on the satisfaction and the sacrifice of Christ, that to the sublime doctrine of free remission were directly opposed the laws of penitence and the practice of pilgrimage, that without the grace of God and the merits of Christ, all that any saint ever did could not bring a soul to heaven, that the merits of saints was a purely human invention, that a man is justified by faith, that justification is always accompanied by sanctification, that there is an eternal distinction between the virtue and vice, that whomsoever the Spirit quickens, he purifies, whom he enlightens, he transforms, that the Spirit is the first and producing cause of all those holy affections and higher graces which enter into and complete the character of the Christian. However far he carried the doctrines of free grace, it is clear that he held them in righteousness of life. He says, let us then deny ourselves and whatever we have made ourselves by sin, and such as we are made by grace, let us continue. If a proud man be converted to Christ and is made humble, he hath denied himself. If a covenant man ceases to covet and giveth of his own to relieve the needy, he hath denied himself. If an impure man changes his life and becometh chaste, he has denied himself. He who withstandeth and forsaketh the unreasonable role of the flesh denieth himself. The cross of Christ is taken when we shrink not from the contempt for the love of the truth, when man is crucified unto the world, and the world is crucified unto him, and he setteth its joy at naught. It is not enough to bear the cross of a painful life, except we follow Christ in his virtues, in meekness, love, and heavenly desire. What is turning to God? Nothing but turning from the world, from sin and from the fiend. What is turning from God but turning to the changing things of this world, to delight in the creatures, the lust of the flesh, and the works of the fiend? To be turned from the world is to set at naught its joys, and to suffer meekly all bitterness, slanders, and deceits for the love of Christ, to leave all occupations unlawfully and unprofitable to the soul, so that man's will and thought become dead to the things which the world loveth and worshipeth. It is perhaps impossibly exactly to define or determine the creed of the Reformer, unless his writings were all collated and authenticated, and some competent and unprejudiced mind were to sift and examine his opinions with all their modifications and changes, and give the results to the world. It would be vain for us to attempt to fix the boundary line of his faith. Though opposed alike to the doctrine and polity of the Romish Church, he yet remained in her communion, accepted and enjoined her preferments, and yielded up his life before her altar. Had he lived at a later period, he would doubtless, with the advantages of pure and increasing light, have entirely quitted her pale. End of chapter 8, having been read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. None of my audios are copyrighted. Please feel free to make as many copies as you desire, to the glory of God.